In August of 1956, a young General Motors stylist named Chuck Jordan pulled into a Detroit storage lot to look over some new cars that weren't even his company's. What he saw sitting there stopped him cold. They were low. They were sharp. They made everything coming out of GM's own studios look a full generation behind. Jordan went straight to his boss and said so. Within weeks, the panic he set off would reach all the way to the top of General Motors' design, and it would quietly seal the fate of a Chevrolet. That hadn't even reached showrooms yet. That car was the 1958 Impala. And here's something strange right off the bat. It wasn't even its own car yet. It was a trim package, bolted on top, of a Bel Air. That almost never happens to a trim package. Here's the part almost nobody realizes watching it roll down the street today. Its one-year lifespan wasn't a punishment for failure. It sold well. It looked sharp. It launched during one of the worst recessions of the decade and still helped Chevrolet outsell Ford by more than 200,000 cars. The body died anyway, and understanding why means understanding a moment of genuine panic inside. General Motors, one that had almost nothing to do with the Impala itself. Let's start with the problem Chevrolet was actually trying to solve. By the mid-1950s, Chevrolet had a branding issue hiding inside a sales success. The division had built its name on being the practical choice, dependable, inexpensive, the car a working family bought because it made sense. That reputation had carried Chevrolet to the top of the sales charts for years. But post-war America was changing. A rising middle class had more money to spend, and a growing number of Chevrolet's own customers wanted something with a little more presence, without stepping all the way up to Buick or Cadillac money. Ford saw the identical opening and answered with an entirely new brand, one with its own dealer network and its own identity, Edsel. It was an expensive, high-risk swing. Chevrolet took the opposite approach. Rather than build a new nameplate from scratch, Chevrolet planners decided to stack a new top-tier trim on top of the existing. Bel Air line, no new dealers required, no new brand to build from zero. It was the cheaper bet, and in hindsight, it was also the smarter one. They called it Impala. But naming it turned out to be the easy part. Figuring out what it should actually look like took 2 more years. And a concept car most people have never heard of. The name had already been circling GM's studios for 2 years by the time it reached production. In January of 1956, Chevrolet's design staff unveiled a show car at the GM Motorama in New York called the Corvette Impala, internally coded XP101. It was a strange experiment. A 5-passenger hardtop built on Corvette design language with a toothy chrome grille, borrowed straight off the 2-seater, and a distinctive reverse-angle rear window pillar that curved the wrong way compared to a normal roofline. GM stylists Carl Renner and Bob Cataray built it to test one specific question. Could the Corvette's sporting image be stretched onto a full-size body without losing what made it work? The show car toured through 1957, then was quietly scrapped. But 2 of its ideas survived. That reverse-angle pillar, which became one of the signature shapes of the production hardtop roofline, and the name stitched onto its flanks. There's a common claim floating around that a separate 1955 show car, the Biscayne, directly shaped the production Impala's roofline. It didn't, not really. The Biscayne was a genuine styling landmark in its own right. Its restrained, fin-free rear end pointed straight at the Corvair 3 years before that car existed. But its fingerprints on the 58 full-size Chevrolet were minor, limited mostly to how the taillight housings were separated into distinct pods. The real shape of the Impala's roof and greenhouse traces back to the Corvette Impala, not the Biscayne. It's a small correction, but it matters, because it shows the production car wasn't just a mashup of leftover concept car parts. It had a specific, traceable design ancestor. So what actually separated an Impala from a cheaper Bel Air sitting next to it on the same showroom floor? Quite a lot, once you looked past the shared doors and hood. Officially, Impala wasn't even its own model in 1958. It was sold as the Bel Air Impala, a trim package layered onto the top of the existing line. But that package included its own shortened greenhouse and lengthened rear deck, its own deeply sculpted rear quarter panels that dealers nicknamed gull wings, and a set of 6 taillights instead of 4, arranged in symmetrical triple clusters on each side. That taillight signature would go on to define the Impala nameplate for decades, eventually reappearing on cars that weren't, even flagship models, and it showed up again on the front-wheel drive. Lumina more than 30 years later. Inside, buyers got a 3-tone upholstery scheme, script badging on the dash and rear deck, crossed flag emblems up front, and broad, ribbed sill panels running the length of the car. And in that first year, the Impala treatment came in exactly 2 body styles, a 2-door hardtop and a convertible. There was no 4-door Impala in 1958 at all, a detail that surprises people who mostly remember the nameplate as a family. Sadden. Credit for the shape goes primarily to Claire McKitchen, Chevrolet's chief designer, the same man behind the celebrated Tri-5 cars of 1955 through 57, but the 1958 program was also unfolding during a much bigger transition inside GM design. Harley Earl, the legendary chief who'd run GM styling since the 1920s, was nearing the end of his career, and leadership was already sliding toward his eventual successor, a sharp, ambitious stylist named Bill Mitchell. That handoff, still in progress in 1958, would matter enormously to what happened next. 1958 wasn't just a big year for one Chevrolet trim level either. It was General Motors' 50th year in business, and the corporation wanted every division to feel the occasion. Cadillac, Buick, Oldsmobile, and Pontiac all rolled out their own longer, lower, wider redesigns for the same model year, and every one of them, apart from Oldsmobile, adopted some version of that new X-frame architecture underneath. Seen from that angle, the Impala wasn't a standalone gamble. It was Chevrolet's piece of a company-wide push to make every single badge in the GM lineup look more modern and more expensive than it had 12 months earlier, which makes it even stranger in hindsight that this particular anniversary body would be the one division after division quietly walked away from within a year or two. Here's something buyers never saw on the showroom floor: an entirely new frame underneath. Every Chevrolet before 1958 rode on a conventional perimeter frame, with rails running the full length of the car. For 1958, engineers replaced it with an X-shaped frame, marketed as the safety girder, with the rails converging toward the center instead of running parallel. The payoff was real: about 30% more rigidity and a passenger compartment that could sit noticeably lower without losing interior room. That's the trick behind the whole longer, lower, wider look the ads leaned on so hard. Wheelbase grew to 117.5 inches, length pushed past 209, and the car ended up 150 to 185 pounds heavier than the 1957 model. But the X-frame had a real weakness. Without continuous rails down each side, it offered noticeably less protection in a side impact than the design it replaced. GM knew it, kept using it anyway through the mid-1960s, and Oldsmobile alone refused to adopt it at all. That new frame also opened the door to an experiment Chevrolet would soon regret. Coil springs replaced the old leaf spring rear suspension, a genuine improvement on its own. But buyers with deeper pockets could step up to a 4-wheel air suspension, borrowed conceptually from Cadillac's Eldorado. Brougham. Rubber air bladders at each wheel instead of steel springs, meant to self-level the car automatically. On paper, it anticipated air suspension systems that wouldn't show up on luxury cars for another 2 decades. In practice, 1958 manufacturing tolerances weren't ready for it. It leaked, it drained real horsepower just running the compressor, and Chevrolet quietly pulled it from the option sheet within a couple of years. Original air suspension hardware is rare on surviving cars today for exactly that reason. Most owners converted back to coils even in period. Under the hood, Chevrolet gave buyers a genuine range of choices, and it's worth walking through them because this was the year the division's engine lineup permanently changed shape. The base engine was still the 235 cubic inch Blue Flame inline-6, now up to 145 horsepower, the same basic architecture that had powered Chevrolets for years. Step up, and buyers found the 283 cubic inch Turbo Fire small block V8, offered in states of tune from 1 to 85 horsepower up through a fuel-injected version pushing toward 290, genuinely advanced technology to find in a mainstream American sedan at the time. But the most important thing Chevrolet put under, that new body wasn't the engine. Buyers talked about in 1958, it was the engine that would matter. 3 years later, a brand new 348 cubic inch big block, marketed as the Turbo Thrust. In its standard 4-barrel form, it made 250 horsepower. Order the Tri-Power version, a 3.2-barrel, carburetors feeding the same block. And the rating climbed to 280 with a small number of rare, mechanical lifter special versions, pushing past 300 for buyers who knew what to ask for. Chevrolet designed it as a smooth, durable big block for a heavier, larger car, not a street racing weapon. But the W-Series architecture underneath the 348 became the direct engineering ancestor of the 409 cubic inch V8 that arrived in 1961, the engine that would eventually get its own hit song, Every 409, owes something to a big block that spent its rookie season under the hood of a one-year-only Impala. Choosing an engine wasn't the only bet buyers had to make. There was a second decision hiding under the hood, and it says just as much about which parts of this car were built to last. Buyers picking a transmission had a real decision to make, too. A 3-speed manual was standard, but most Impala customers stepped up to one of 2 automatics. Powerglide, a simple 2-speed unit that had been in Chevrolet's lineup for years, had already earned a reputation for being tough and easy to service. Turboglide, a more sophisticated 3-speed design introduced the year before, promised smoother shifts but developed a reputation for fragility and expensive repairs when something inside it went wrong. Chevrolet would drop Turboglide entirely by 1961, quietly conceding, yet again, that the simpler, tougher option had been the better long-term bet. It's a pattern that shows up again and again across this car's story. Ambitious new engineering paired right alongside it with the plain, dependable solution that ultimately won out. The transmission, the suspension, and eventually the entire body all followed the exact same script. But none of that explains why Chevrolet killed a successful car after just 1 year. For that answer, we have to leave Chevrolet's showroom and walk into Chrysler's. Rewind to that Detroit storage lot in August of 1956, Chuck. Jordan had gone to check out the new for 1957 Chrysler and Plymouth products. The second generation of design chief Virgil Exner's Forward Look, a styling program that had pushed those cars dramatically lower, sharper, and more heavily finned than anything else on the American road. Jordan reported what he'd seen straight to Bill Mitchell. Then Harley Earl, second in command at GM Styling. More GM stylists went to look for themselves. What followed by multiple first-hand accounts from people who were in the room was close to genuine alarm. GM's own upcoming lineup, heavier, boxier, built around what now looked like an outdated design philosophy, suddenly looked like it belonged to a previous decade next to what Chrysler was about to release. Here's the timing that decided everything. By August of 1956, the 1958 model year was already locked in. Styling, tooling, engineering, all of it was too far along to scrap and restart. The 1958 Impala you're looking at, X-frame and all, was baked in. But the 1959 lineup was still on the drawing board, early enough to blow up and rebuild from scratch. And that's exactly what GM did. Mitchell's studios tore up the existing 1959 plans and rushed out a completely new design. Philosophy, lower, more heavily finned, and far more aggressive than anything the 1958 cars had attempted. Some accounts even suggest Harley Earl was traveling in Europe while the most dramatic of those changes were finalized, and came home to find the direction already set. Whether or not that detail is exactly right, the outcome wasn't in dispute. GM's own design leadership later admitted, in oral history interviews given years afterward, that the reaction to Chrysler's cars had bordered on genuine panic, and it showed in some of the more overcorrected shapes that came out of the rushed 59 program. That crash redesign is the real reason the 1958 Impala's body only existed for 1 model year. It wasn't retired because it failed. It was retired because its sequel got torn up and rebuilt from the ground floor in response to a rival automaker, and there was no version of events where GM kept building a car whose entire styling, language, the reverse angle roofline, the sculpted gull wing quarters, the X-frame, proportions tuned specifically around that one body, got carried forward into a lineup. Built on a completely different design philosophy, the '58 Impala wasn't punished for its own mistakes. It got caught in the blast radius of a decision made about an entirely different car, for an entirely different model year, in response to an entirely different company. And here's the part that makes the sales numbers so remarkable in hindsight. Despite launching into a recession that pushed national unemployment above 7% that summer, and despite riding on a body whose replacement was already taking shape inside, GM before it ever reached dealer lots, the Impala did not struggle. Chevrolet moved roughly 125,000, sport coupes and just under 56,000 convertibles in that first year. Alone, about 15% of the division's entire 1958 output, on a nameplate that had existed on paper for barely 2 years and was still, technically, just a trim package. The coupe started at $2,586, the convertible at $2,124. Real money in a recession year, and enough to make the convertible the single most expensive model in Chevrolet's entire lineup that year. A genuine flagship moment for a brand that had spent decades selling itself on being the affordable choice rather than the aspirational one. It helped push Chevrolet back past Ford for the top production spot that year, a title the division had briefly lost. Compare that to Ford's much larger bet on the exact same market gap. Edsel, launched as a fully separate brand with its own dealer network, would become one of the most cited commercial failures in American business history within a few years. Chevrolet's cheaper, more conservative gamble, a trim package riding on a body that management already knew was temporary, turned out to be the one buyers actually wanted. There's a real irony sitting at the center of all this. The 1958 Impala is remembered today as one of the most collectible one-year-only American cars ever built. A well-preserved original convertible can bring well into 6 figures at auction, not because Chevrolet built something disposable, but because Chevrolet built something they never got the chance to build twice. Because a stylist looked at somebody else's cars in a parking lot and decided GM couldn't afford to look old-fashioned 12 months later. The Impala wasn't the car that failed. It was the car that happened to be standing in the room when GM decided its next design needed to be something else entirely. If this era of Detroit design interests you, there's an equally strange story in how Chrysler's own 1957 quality problems nearly undid the advantage that Forward Look had just handed them, worth digging into on its own. What other one-year-only American car deserves its own investigation? Drop the name below. The most interesting answer might become the next story.